Okay, so let's get started. I'm excited this morning to have a conversation here with Mike, who we call Moldy Mike, but Mike Fisher. Today we're talking about how home remediation or dealing with the structure is so crucial for CIRS and other people dealing with biotoxin illness. So we're diving into this remediation, but really what we would call medically important remediation. We're talking with Mike Fisher today with Vital Homes. So here in Utah, where I work clinically, I vetted out probably a dozen different remediators because, as those of you that have been in this world, and Mike can talk about this a little bit, the moldy world is kind of a shady world when it comes to remediation. There is definitely good, bad, better, and best. And especially when it comes to people dealing with health concerns. And when I met Mike and realized he already had all the certifications that dealt with medically or health important remediation. And then when I told him there was one for CIRS, he and his crew dove in and took it. And then going through the experience with my own home, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I have extreme confidence in his knowledge and his team. And so today we want to talk about that. We want to talk about why this is so important to do this the right way, and some different solutions and different things to think about. So Mike, thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
I want you to give us, you've been in this world for 20 plus years. Is that correct?
yeah. We started out as a water remediation company, and then because of that, you end up doing mold jobs, and you end up finding yourself as some basements flood. They've flooded maybe a dozen times in the past. So we come in and we're like, oh shoot, there's mold, and then we have to deal with that. And for years, we dealt with it just like everyone else, where it was just pretty nonchalantly. Um, we had um, we had some clients that kind of changed that for us, and so we went out and got certified, and the certification for mold was pretty basic, and it's not a required thing you have to have in Utah. You don't have to have a mold license or a mold certificate, certification of any sort. It's just you go out and take a class if you want, or you say you did, or someone from your company took it, and then that's what I see a lot with companies is you say, okay, well, I see your guys are working here. They're disturbing all this mold, and there's no containment, there's no negative
Right.
pressure, things like that. And they're like, well, I'll send the guy over who's certified. And you're like, why is the guy not working on it certified, right? So we for years thought we were doing a great job. We had a client that honestly we may have thought she was crazy, and because she kept saying, "Hey, we have all this mold," and we're like, "Yeah." We found a little bit of mold in her master bathroom, which was connected to her master bedroom, and we said, okay, well, let's take care of this. And she said, no, there's still mold in my master bedroom. I know there is. And we went around, looked, and with moisture meters, thermal imaging, with flashlights, everything, could not find it. And so we found a dog. I think this is about in 2008. And we found a dog that was here in Utah. And we said, okay, bring him in. He came in and he found it right next to her headboard,
Mm,
right next to her bed. And we're like, oh wow, we couldn't have seen that. There's no sign other than the dog hit on it. We pull back the tack, there's mold right there. So we
mm,
clean the mold, and then we get this the client comes in, says you didn't do it good enough, and we're like, we did it, like we did fine, right?
yeah.
Cleaned it
Yeah.
out, we cut the drywall, pulled the base, we did everything. We painted it, we did all that, which was super archaic, mold remediation techniques. And she's like, it's not good enough. So we came back in and cleaned it again. And then she
Yeah.
came back in and she said, okay, that's right. And so what
Mm,
we found there is we weren't doing it right. We didn't have the knowledge or the skill to find the mold like we thought we did. And so we ended up through this process, we ended up using that dog throughout her house. And through this process, we ended up really loving this. All my guys fell in love with her. We just really like this woman.
mm,
And we're
yeah.
like, okay, she's no longer crazy, and we don't know what we're doing. And so then we started looking into what is it that we're going to do to be better, to catch these things, and to be able to help people who are like her, who are super sensitive. And so,
Yeah.
how to send.
I'm going to stop you for a second. So that mentality, by the way, that you and your team have, and you know this, but I want people who are watching and looking at this and considering this, is extremely rare in your industry. Um, I tell people all the time, it's really easy to do a crappy test, crappy remediation, and then a crappy post test to say that your crappy remediation did a good job and make a lot of money doing it. And then the patient or the homeowner is still sick. And so it's very rare to find people in this industry who say, hold on a second, we're not doing this the right way. We're not doing good enough because we actually care about the people that are paying us to do it. I would say, this is why I vetted out a dozen people before we got to you. It doesn't exist out there. And when we're dealing people with people who truly are dealing with a building that can make them sick, that is so vitally important, but also so rare. So I love that you and your team caught that. So now kind of pick up to how you guys iterated to get to where you are today.
So then we started trying to find out. We took the common class again. Try and from all we knew is this is what it is, right? And then we that woman. So we worked with her for a few years or a couple years fixing her house there, probably about a year really. And then we didn't hear from her very often. We heard because she'd call us up and say, "Hey, my daughter's having this issue." We'd go out and see a different house and things like that.
Yeah.
And then she kind of went quiet on us. And then recently, about 4 years ago, she called us and she said, "Okay, I did what you probably would have told me not to do. I bought a house that caught on fire." And so, we went in there and, you put fire out with water. And so,
Yeah.
it's the same thing. It's when we find clients that we're just not doing the right job for, or then we have a client that says, "Hey, I can't take the chemicals you're using." And we're like,
Yeah.
"Well, we're using a super, what's called a botanical. It's from thyme oil, right? So it's as safe as we could find, and we've used it for years." And they're like, "It's still bugging me. It affects me." And so we're like, "Gosh, what does this mean?" And so we found another class that was for people who have sensitivity. So it's mold remediation for sensitized individuals. We took
Yeah.
that. We learned some stuff in there. We felt like we were, probably the best at doing what we were doing here in our area. And then, honestly, I can't remember how we got in touch with you, or you got in touch with us, or how we lined up.
You stopped by when I wasn't here and you left a stuffed animal dog and some handouts. Said you wanted to talk, and I was like, all right, let's talk.
Well, and then you guys I got a text, I think from Jenna that said, there's a CIRS thing going
Yeah.
on. Would
Yeah.
you, it just like it was last year. And she's like, "Would you go to that?" And or no, you had just passed it. By the time we got back to talking,
Yeah,
it,
it was the
it
online course that was now available. Yeah.
Yeah, so it just happened, and we're like, "Gosh, what is this?" And so she told us and then about CIRS and about the training, and then we lined up, got to talking to you, and then as soon as we saw that, we're like, "Okay, this is great," because a lot of the guys I follow that are industrial hygienists, or they're IEPs, so indoor environmental professionals. They teach classes and stuff. They were the ones teaching this class, and I'm like, "Okay, this is great." So I got in, and so you introduced us to CIRS. We jumped all over it, and we love it. Honestly, it's the right way to do it. We're not for those individuals. We're not using crazy chemicals, and it's all about removal, not treating. And that's one thing that for years, we had kept following companies who come in and promise you, "We have this magic pixie dust," as we say in our industry, that it's going to come in and it's going to get rid of all the mold, and we can apply it as a fog, and it'll go through all your cabinets, and it'll get behind all your walls. And we had worked behind those companies so many years, saying, well, the client would go out, they'd use that company or a company that does that, and then 6 months later or 4 months later, they're feeling sick again. They have a guarantee. It's a year guarantee. They come back out, they fog again. A few months later, they're feeling sick again, and they call us up. And it's like, "Okay, well, okay. Can you guys come in and find the source, get rid of the source, and then help us get it clean?" So
Yeah, and I want to talk about that in a second, but I want to kind of put a pause and kind of take a second we've mentioned this term CIRS, and some people who might be watching this content or, know what that is, but there might be some who don't. So I want to take a minute to kind of introduce that. And then, we'll talk about kind of how you helped with our personal journey, and then we'll kind of come back around. So CIRS stands for Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. And so the way I always define that for people is syndrome is defined as, a collection of symptoms and or named diagnoses that we can put in a category that's created by your immune system responding with a large amount of inflammation for a very long period of time. There's a couple of keys to this. It's always in relation to some type of biotoxin exposure. Now we're talking about mold and water damaged buildings today, because that is the biggest cause of this, which can be mold. There's certain bacteria that can be a part of that are activated by water damage. However, this other biotoxins can be things like the bacteria that can cause or be related to things like Lyme disease. Different parasites or infected foods can cause this, or bacteria and water sources, algae bloom, which we see a lot around here, late in the summertime in our lakes. I work with a lot of people who might have spent time overseas, who maybe have gotten a parasite or something like that that's triggering this also. But there are viruses are not biotoxins, but are those things. And so if you're out there researching this, mold and water damaged buildings are probably the causes that are talked about the most. And part of that is because um, we know that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, says that over half the buildings in the United States are water damaged, and that's reported. So, and let me back up a second. The third factor with CIRS is you have to have a genetic predisposition, meaning your immune system has certain genetic markers that don't know how to identify and respond to these specific biotoxins. So really a person that has this, if those genes are activated or turned on, your body doesn't know how to identify, fight, and kill these biotoxins, therefore creating inflammatory reactions that last a really long time that can turn into multi-system, multi-symptom issues all the way down to brain atrophy. And we can talk more about that in another discussion. But we know that 24 to 25% of the population will have this. So these genetic markers. So that said, if the EPA is telling us at least half the buildings in the United States are experiencing this, and 24, a quarter of the population have this genetic predisposition to an immune system that doesn't know how to regulate these biotoxins, then we know that probably 50 million Americans are dealing with this, either diagnosed, most of them undiagnosed, or diagnosed with other things. And so this is truly potentially an epidemic here, not only in our country, but abroad. And we know that one of the kind of crazy, non-logical parts about this condition and this illness is that the building can actually be the very thing that's making you sick. When I talk about with my patients, I'm like, look, we can do all this from a medical standpoint, but until we verify and know that you are living in a non-exposure environment, the medical work's only going to get us so far. Now, it can be very helpful, but we have to deal in the environment. And so tapping into my experience, and then we could probably do a whole conversation on our family's journey through this. But, as we started learning more about this, several years ago, and then looking at symptoms and health issues that not only my wife, but my kids had been dealing with, we decided, hey, let's look and figure this out. And all of us got tested and screened, which there is a very validated diagnostic process for this through lab work, et cetera. We did that, and come to find out, all of us, we didn't test our 4-year-old, but all of us were positive for CIRS with varying different symptoms. And so we started doing the medical work for this. But of course, being someone who diagnoses and treats and works with patients with this, we tested our home and found that our home was very high in multiple different biotoxins. And that's where, as we were trying to vet out the right people, we brought in Mike. And so I want you to talk a little bit about, kind of this process. I remember a couple of things stood out. One, I want you to talk about experience with Chap, which is your dog, which I will include some video of this that I took in our home. Awesome, super fascinating to watch. But two, and this is one of the things that I hear all of the time, and you can verify this because you and your crew were in there. but I would say 98, 99% of the problem was not something that you could see. It was completely unseen. So when people always tell me, and I hear it all the time, well, we don't have mold. I'm like, well, 99% of the problem that's making you sick is somewhere in your house that is not visible. So it's not the stuff that you can scrub off the wall. And I'll include pictures of this when we post this, but behind our shower, I think I remember you texting my wife one day saying like 10 out of 10 is the worst we've ever seen. Yours is like a 7+ out of 10. And so we went through this process with Mike, and I can tell you now, being back in our home, feel dramatically different as I'm in there. But yeah, so let's kind of talk about, as you come into a home and use ours as the example, kind of what the process and what the experience looks like. Starting, a CHAP and the ways that you test and look for things, what a you mentioned kind of like the cheap, easy way to remediate, but what like a true, real way to medically or health sensitivity remediate, what that looks like.
Yeah, yeah. Let me go back to this. So you said the EPA says 50% of water damage or houses have water damage in it. I would say that is so low. That is so low.
Yeah.
I've never been in a house we haven't found.
Reported, right? Yeah.
Right. I've never been in a house that we haven't found mold, and I've been in new houses. We have clients that call us when they're buying a new house and brand new house, and so and we find it. And sometimes that's by the lumber they're pulling in, but most of the time, it's because a plumber did something or someone turned on something that they shouldn't have or left it on, and they didn't really tell anyone. And so it's I'd say that number is super low that the EPA is.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's more
So yeah.
like 80+%, right?
Oh yeah. Now we're not called in on every house, so we're called in from people who are saying, "Hey, I'm
You got
suspect."
a problem. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, this is great because I think what is would be nice to know is if you're calling me up and saying, "Hey, I think I might have mold in it," what's that going to look like? And so first off, we are mold assessors, right? So we know what we're looking for. We know mold. We know how to find mold without a dog. It's awesome to have the dog because he finds things that we don't find. And
Right.
then to have probably my best tool is my flashlight
Hmm.
and just knowledge and just being able to know how to
Like
find
what to look for. Yeah.
and then my second best tool is probably the dog. And but it's we come in as assessors first. So we walk through the house, and we are the best thing we can get is any sort of history that has. So the nice thing is you guys had a great history of your house. You knew a lot about it. You knew the previous owner. You knew a lot about the house and what had happened there. And there was some things. There were some shady things, not shady, but some things that happened with the builders that they didn't do right in the building process. And because of that, you already had knowledge of remediation that had gone on. And so we walk through that house and we kind of give you an interview. So we're asking questions, even if it's new, but we're asking or a newer house to you. We're asking questions. And often what we find is some of these questions trigger memories that everyone forgets. Oh, yeah, there was the time that dot, dot, dot happened.
Yeah.
And so we go through the house and we're with a flashlight, kind of just quickly walking through as in the interview. And then we're also setting up each room so that Chap, the dog, has the best chance to find mold in that area if there is some. So we're setting up each room. And then after we go through that, uh, we go grab the dog and we pull the dog through and then we run the dog. And so then after that, we say, okay, here's what we found, here's what the dog found, and then here's what we think is your overall mold problem.
Yeah.
And here is, we will find low-hanging fruit. It's I mean, it's only a handful of times that we haven't found this low-hanging fruit that just every house has. And it's just the way houses were built, and it's going to mold because there's no better way to make windows the way they make them,
Sure.
or
Sure.
no better way to make sinks and toilets the way they make them. So we'll find that low-hanging fruit, and then we'll teach you how to clean that. And so, because you don't want to pay someone else to do that. That's
Which I
super.
love, by the way, right? And we'll talk more about this, but there's a lot of things that you can do on your own that can be really impactful. I think, when I sit down and talk with people about this, people like instantly get overwhelmed that they're gonna have this like $250,000 remediation renovation on their hands. And it's like, look, those exist, but the reality is there's some of this low hanging fruit that can be handled really easily. and can make a dramatic impact. But then, sometimes you got to do more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So there often we are able to come in, we find a bunch of low-hanging fruit, we find out about other mold that they may have. But if every house has 100% mold, which every house does, right? It's all broken down different. So one house is going to may have one big area and a few small areas, and then a small particulate clean needed, and that's their mold. Another may have a dozen or 2 dozen incidents that have happened over the years, and then a small particulate clean and dusting is a bigger portion of that. And it's like, if you can, and so what we want to do is say, okay, let's look at the situation because I have clients that can't do much because they don't own the house. They
Yeah, yeah, it's a huge conversation.
yeah, so they're not in a position to do it financially right now. And so what is it? How do we come in and take this 100% amount of mold that's there and break that down? This is what you guys can do to get rid of big chunks of this. Here's how to do a small particulate clean. Well, we went from 100% down to this. And maybe that's enough for now to let your body start to heal and start to
Yeah.
feel better. And what we find, I mean, we went, man, we had 2 weeks ago, we had 2 appointments right in a row. And honestly, I have another assessor with me. His name's Tyler. He's with our company. And we went through and we're like, look, you're not in a position. I'm even going to run my dog.
Hmm.
And it's both of these. We left literally fighting back tears because of the situation they're in. And one was a mother and son, the 32-year-old son or 27-year-old son that lived in the basement and has not had a job for years and cannot work and cannot do anything because he's just sick as anything, right? He's just terribly sick.
Man.
And the house has tons of dust and just a ton of low-hanging fruit. And it's like, look, I'm going to tell you right now, let's get this stuff taken care of because if we can take care of this and it's still a problem, then let's bring the dog in. Then let's charge you to, like let's take
Yeah.
that money. But until that, let's not do that. Let's take that money to go towards removing. And that was 2 jobs. And ironically, they were both in a row. One was a Thursday
Hmm.
night, the next one was a Friday morning. And we
Hmm.
walked out of those houses going, my gosh, what do you do? Neither of these people had people they could rely on to bring in family. They didn't have he had no siblings. They didn't have anyone that they could bring in to help them with this. So it's going to be
Yeah.
this nightmare process. But really, what most remediators would have done is, oh, let's take care of this and let's take care of this. And on that 100% scale, it was probably this much of the mold and this much of the cost. And so it's
Hmm.
like, no, let's not focus there. Let's get rid of the bulk of the mold
Yeah.
that you can in a reasonable way, and then let's worry as we get farther in and as we take a lot of this mold out. What we find is if you can get someone feeling better, if you have someone who's running at 20% versus someone who's running at 80%, I mean, what you're able to get out of them input or output wise is so
Yeah.
much more. So then they can say, you know what, I can go back to work, make money, come back in and address these issues. And
Yeah.
so,
We talk about that all the time here in our clinic is look like, because there are CIRS clinicians across the country who will not take you on as a patient until you have proven that you're out of remediation. And I'm like, or you're out of exposure. And I'm like, well, like you just said, this person's brain capacity, physical capacity might be 20%, and they can't handle that. And even while they're exposure, there's some things we can do to say, okay, let's treat you, let's take care of some dust or do some things and say, okay, can we get you to 70? Can we get you to 80? So you're not all the way healthy, but now you have capacity to even just make some of these decisions, handle the stress of what all this is, be able to work more effectively or more efficiently, so that the daunting task that this really can be, um, seems more feasible. So kind of bringing that back. So in our house, we ran CHAP, we found some areas, and really our master bathroom was the biggest thing. And again, looking on the outside, and yeah, could you probably see on some of the shower door like corners and stuff, some mold growth that people probably think is just normal. And but once you guys got in, and this is key, I've talked to patients who are, trying to do this on their own or whatever, and there's not containment. So you've mentioned that, as I walked in, what that is, there's literally plastic sheets containing the area that they're doing the tear out. There's definitely negative pressure areas so that as they come out of those with everything wrapped up, we're not contaminating the rest of the house. And you guys started tearing apart our bathroom and started getting rid of it and then the area underneath it. And what I loved about the process is not only did you do that so thoroughly, but constantly rechecking and constantly working on things through the process so that we're making sure it was done correctly the entire time.
Yeah. So important. It's so important to just set up the right containment. I can't stress that enough. If I had a petri dish and I was growing mold on it, I can have a 1 inch square that has 100,000 spores and not be visible.
Yeah.
So what everyone wants to say is, I don't see any mold down there. It doesn't have to be visible to be present. And I'm not saying it's going to be crazy, but if you have a sensitive person and you have a square, so when we see people, I just got a call from a realtor yesterday, and she said, Mike, I have a buyer that's buying a house. The previous owner flooded the house, did not take care of it right. He was out of the country. Their realtor told him to brought in someone to dry the carpet, and that's all they dried was the carpet. And so
Oh
the
man.
drywall and behind the base, there's mold. She sent me some videos that were just terrible. And they just called a guy in and he's cut 17 inches up. I don't know why they picked 17 inches, but he's cut 17 inches up the perimeter of a couple of rooms. And she said, look, I can see mold still going up the drywall. No containment. This is a brand new house. No one's ever lived in it. And
Mm.
so she's like, I can see mold still going up the drywall, and he has no containment. Carpet still down, everything. And so picture a 1 inch square having 100,000 that you can't see. A 1 inch square that has fully grown small diameter mold can have 10 million spores in a 1 inch. And so I'm not saying that's what it was that hers was, but I mean, she had millions of spores per square inch. And and then as you disturb that, picture a dandelion field, right? You come in a big, nice gust of wind, and then you just poof everything into the air. Same thing with mold. It's just dry. It's sitting there waiting to be disturbed so it can go into the air and then settle somewhere, hopefully find some water, and then regrow. So
Yeah,
now
man.
say this about showers. Like your shower, what you were seeing around the edges and stuff, totally normal because filth and skin
Yep.
cells, everything that hits down there. With time, water, and dust or food, that mold's going to grow, right? So that's a
Yep.
totally common thing. But to see what was behind your shower was crazy, but unrelated. You may have not have a problem with the behind your shower, but still may have a problem inside your.
Right.
But
Right.
yours had failed for years and had created a huge problem. I mean, huge
That
problem.
was just not visible. And I think we've talked about dust a few times, and I think the reason why we talk about that is so, when I teach about mold, right? So mold is literally the fungus that you can see growing somewhere. That isn't necessarily the thing that makes people sick. It's mold kicks off mycotoxins, which are invisible. And this is why some of the proper ways to truly measure if there is a problem in the home is by collecting dust, not air samples.
Right.
Um, and in this world, they will take air samples if you're in a legal case. But what I've always been taught by the IAPs, and you've taught me this and reconfirmed it, is a negative air test. So if someone comes in your home and they're taking an air test, a negative air test, it does not say there is or is not a problem. If it's positive, there is a problem. If it's negative, you probably still do, but it's just not being circulated in the air. But these invisible mycotoxins land in the dust. And so this is why you've taught us a dozen times that, dust management is sometimes the most effective thing that you can do in your home. And there's a lot of ways to do that because that's getting the stuff out that's making you sick that you're breathing in when you're moving around, when you turn the ceiling fan on, when you open a window, it's all invisible, but as that's being kicked up and you're breathing it in. And so with this, I want to talk about before we get to some more of the DIY, I want to talk about some of these common pitfalls. We've talked about not setting up containment. And every time I hear a patient tell me that they like ripped out the stuff themselves and carried it through their house to the, dumpster outside, I'm just like, oh my gosh, you just like infected and exposed your entire house. But common pitfalls tied with, and this is, if there's one heartbreaking thing about this illness, other than the symptoms that CIRS can cause, which can truly be debilitating, it's someone who paid to have some type of remediation or fogging or service that does not work done on their home. They get sick. They might do it again. They're still sick. And then eventually they come around to somebody like you and saying, I've done all this stuff. I need to do it. But now, they might be several thousands or tens of $1,000s deep in the wrong types of remediation or mold management. And so, from your perspective, from your expertise, what are those common pitfalls or the common, and I don't want to call them schemes, but kind of the common thing. And again, it happens. People are like, oh, this certain tool or fogging is guaranteed, but we actually know that they don't do their job. It basically collects everything and redistributes it somewhere else. And I've talked with patients that have done these several times, and then they still can't figure out why they have symptoms. They still can't figure out why their labs, their biomarkers aren't changing, even though they're saying, well, I'm doing this thing that I'm told will work. So from your expertise and all of your training, if you could say maybe like the top 3 to 5 either pitfalls or services that are being offered as solutions that truly are not, but actually make it worse, what would you say those things are?
Oh, it's a good question. Let me back up for a minute. Can I do that? Because
Yeah.
often before we get to that, we need to know that we have mold in the house, right? And
Yeah.
so let's look at what happens. And you touched on it briefly, but I just want to share a couple of stories. Number one is you're right. Air testing is a terror. Like it's not the right way to find out if you have mold. We got a call from an attorney that said, "Hey, look, we had an industrial hygienist was called in on a client of mine's condo from the HOA. They came in and took 2 tests, well, technically 3, one outside and 2 in the house. One was in the kitchen, one was in the family room, and they didn't find mold. They didn't have find any levels. He's like, this house is flooded because of the outside water coming from outside like 4 times or more.
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, I know there's mold in there. I can see mold in a corner there. And they're telling us there's no mold there. And so we came in and we set up the same 2 tests that they did so that we could prove a point. And so we set them up exactly where they did because we had pictures where they set them up. And then we went in and started looking through the house and we took the dog through and he said, okay, mold is in this wall, mold's over here, mold's over here. We went in and we put a hole into the wall and we put a straw in the wall and we sucked air out of that. And then we put another one over into a plug where the outlet is. And we put that in and we sucked air out of that. We took the same samples they took and then we went into the utility room and we put a air sampler. Again, we wanted to use the same methods they were doing, so it wasn't like we were trying to cheat something. We put an
Right.
air sampler near where we believed there was mold, and then we put another air sampler in the bedroom that it normally the water would come into the house. And we got in the kitchen, we had 0 spores of Stachybotrys. Stachybotrys is black mold. And
Yeah.
so 0 spores in the air test, just like the guys did when they brought in the next one or the one before. The kitchen opens up to the laundry room, like it's like one room if you open the 2 doors. And we had one, so this is 8 feet away, literally measured 8 feet away. And we had 3,600 spores of Stachybotrys come up 8 feet away. So air testing is not the right way to do it. We had our other sampler right next to what we believed a portion of the source was. In the walls, we had 36,000 spores, and I can't remember, 60 or 40,000 spores in the other wall. And so sampling, so here's what this really just irks me about this industry. And that is even mold dogs. And that is when you get to the point where you're going to spend all the money to get it tested and then hire a mold dog to come in, you're checking a box, right?
Right.
You're
Yeah.
saying, you're saying, okay, we're to this point where we know we're being affected. It could be our house. Let's check a box and make sure that mold's not there. And
Yep.
there are dogs out there, and there are dogs locally that don't know that they are handlers only. It's just a person and a dog. They're not mold assessors. They don't
Right.
have experience in that. They're not remediators. They just come in and handle a dog. And then they're not, and so many of these dogs are not imprinted on all the molds. And we've gone through, with my dog, I've gone through 4 jobs of other mold dogs, and every single time we find more mold.
Hmm.
And it's like,
Hmm.
what do like it's just such a shame. When we got our dog back, we didn't charge and for the first month, and we didn't charge even where we are, what we charge now for probably 5 months
Hmm.
because we wanted to know that we were checking that box and you could actually check that box and say, yeah, that's not a problem, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, and that's just not the case. And that's the same thing with mold inspectors. They come in and where you find it often is a home inspector. If a home inspector comes in and it's just added mold inspection or mold tests to their package, often they don't know how to set those up. I hear that people are saying, okay, every 1,000 square feet of the house, we'll set up a air sampler.
Hmm.
So if it's 5,000, we have 5 tests, and sometimes they're taking outside samples. Sometimes they're not. I have a good friend that's a home inspector and does mold inspections. And it's nice to see a home inspector that actually knows more about mold and is actually trying to
Right.
find mold rather than just trying to check a box and trying to add to their bill. But
Sure.
it's so common. So the first things I would say is make sure you're getting someone who knows what they're doing when it comes
Yep.
to mold inspection because it's the box you're checking and it's an expensive box. And so it's like, get the right person in to do that. And then when it comes to mold remediation, that's the thing. What there is no magic pixie dust, right? If there was, I would own it, right? I own a $20,000 Steramist machine that just the reason we use it is to deactivate mycotoxins. Well, it's been shown to deactivate mycotoxins. And so, but what that's used for. Other companies say that's for mold. There's another company in Utah that uses it and it says this is going to kill your mold. It's not going to. And it's going to leave the body because what is it doing? How does it get rid of the body?
Right.
And
Right.
that's the problem with so many of these things. You hear about people saying, oh, just use ozone. Ozone is not the right thing to use. Had we used
Ozone for home cleaning, right?
for home cleaning, right? I'm sorry,
Industrial
yes,
cleaning.
for
Yeah.
trying
Yeah.
to get rid of mold in a house. If
Yep.
we use mold or ozone in your house, we would have forced your your mold behind your shower to create mycotoxins. So your mold behind your shower was a healthy, thriving, living colony. And that's what a mold needs to be. And then when it feels threatened by something in nature, it's another spore or a bacteria, it creates a toxin that it coats itself in. That's what a mycotoxin is. So a
Yep.
mycotoxin is a chemical. It floats around only if it's attached to a mold spore or dust or a skin cell that floats around because
Yep.
it's a chemical, right? It's not a chemical that can just, it's not a gas, it's a chemical. And so when we're getting rid of a mycotoxin it has a bunch of atoms on it, right? And so what we're trying to do to get rid of a mycotoxin is we're coming in and stealing some of those atoms with something. So in our case, we're using hydroxyl to do that with that Steramist. It comes in, it's a gas that is not why am I forgetting the word? It's a gas that's oh for crying out loud, we're going to edit this. Uh, oh crap, what is the word for it? Um, that's an unstable. So a mycotoxin is an unstable molecule. I'm sorry, hydroxyl. Hydroxyl is an
Yes.
unstable
Yes. Yes.
molecule, right? So it has a half-life of like a nanosecond.
Hmm.
Where ozone is also an unstable molecule, but the ozone has a half-life of a half hour. We used to use that back when we started. That's what we'd use. And so what we're finding with the different studies that are being done is what that molecule is doing, if it's not at the right amount for the right amount of time and not getting enough exposure to that mold, it's threatening that mold colony that's thriving. And so now it says, oh shoot, we're being threatened. What do we do when we're threatened? We create a mycotoxin. And so it's not
Yeah.
the right thing to use. But we do hear about people coming in and fogging. Ozone is another one we hear about. Or, you know what? I'll just get rid of it. I'll just cut it out. Don't worry about it. And then I'll paint over it. That's the other thing. They want to use kills. In our industry, there's
Or
something
bleach, right? We will just clean it with bleach.
bleach does not kill mold. And so, and really what it does is it only harms mold when it's a gas. And as it's evaporating, it's a gas. and then it leaves water. So it's like go in.
Is what mold needs to, and you're putting it on your drywall, which you're basically bleach creates mold food, and mold nutrients to grow more mold.
Yeah.
So, man, we could talk for hours, but what I want to kind of tap on to kind of get to, at least wrap up this discussion because we've mentioned it a few times. And yes, the ideal and the best case scenario is you have somebody like you and your team that comes in, identifies everything, and you do the proper, we would call gross remediation, not gross because it's disgusting, even though it is. Gross meaning we're taking structural stuff out and then cleaning behind that. What are, and this is where I'd say, and again, you've coached us through this with different places, but if that's not possible, what would be, and we mentioned small particulate cleaning, and I know this is part of the answer, but what are like the three steps of the DIY? Here's what you can do for right now. And we've talked about small particulate cleaning, dust management. But if you could say, hey, here's the best starting point, like you've talked about, if this is 100% and you're really like gross actual mold growth is here, we've got all this, and we've talked about how mycotoxins live in the dust and all this type of stuff. But now, what can I do between here and here, to really make a huge change? And if you were to give somebody, hey, here's like the three things or three-step process, what is that? That somebody can be actionable right now. Because if somebody's watching this, they're like, oh man, I don't have the ability to do all of the above, or I'm scared to do all of the above, but I need to make a change. And you're right, people who are renting or leasing, or in certain communities where doing remediation really is just not possible, we have to make a change. What's that? Hey, do this, 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 and we know you'll be able to close that gap at least a certain amount so that you can start feeling better.
Yeah. Biggest thing is dust management is getting the dust out. So we say do a fine particulate clean. We have videos that we share to our clients that show you step by step how to do a fine particulate clean.
Awesome.
And then uh, if you're keeping carpet, it's vacuuming your carpet 15 times. This is super anecdotal. This is a number I pulled out of my ear years ago. And I just said, look, you've got to vacuum this carpet a ton of times, like 15 times. And then for some reason it stuck. And the people who do that versus the people who do 4 or 5 times and call it good are drastically different. A good example of this is we got called out to a mold job out in Mona, Utah, and they had flooded their basement and they had pulled all the carpet out and they dried the floor, the concrete floor, and they put new carpet down. They didn't dry the walls, they didn't dry anything. And we said, look, we've got to replace the carpet. I mean, there's just enough mold here, it's going to be impossible to get out. And he's
Yeah.
like, well, we're not going to. So what is the next step? And I said, okay, if we're going to remediate, we'll cover all the flooring. So we covered all that. Half the basement was tile, half the basement was carpet. Covered all the carpet with 6 mil plastic, taped it all down. Came in, remediated the basement, got all the baseboard out and the drywall out, insulation that was affected. Got all that out and said, okay, so in order to pass this test, the clearance test, which is done by a third party, we don't test our own work. We can find the mold, we'll remediate the mold, but we don't test our own work.
Yep.
And we,
That's key too, by the way.
that's what?
That's key too, by the way. You
Right.
don't want the person saying, "Oh, I did a great job." Moving on. So anyway, sorry, back to
So I said, look, you have got to vacuum this 15 times minimum, right? And he said, well, my wife and daughter will do it over the weekend. We'll test on Monday. They tested on Monday, still had tons of spores. And I said, look, one of two things happened here. One, you didn't vacuum well enough. Like 15 might not have been enough times, or we've missed a spot that there's still mold in the house that we don't know about in that basement. And he sheepishly said, "Let me ask my wife." And I'm like, "I know they didn't do it, right?" Just the way you said it was like super obvious. And I'm like, "Okay." So then he said, "Okay, we'll take the next 2 days. We'll vacuum it 15 times." He said, but before that, he said, "But we bought these filters," and he had like air doctors or something like that.
yeah,
He had 3 of them in his thing, and I said, "Now those tell you what the air, like the content is in the air is. What color are they?" And he's like, "The ones he bought, I don't know that they're air doctor, but had green, yellow, orange, and red." And he said, well, the first day they were on red and orange. And he said, and then they fluctuate between yellow and orange. I think they're not very, whatever. And I said, just watch those as you vacuum correctly. And so then they watched him, and he said all three of them went down from either orange or red, especially when you start vacuuming, it starts kicking
Yeah.
stuff, but it dropped down to either green, and one of them stayed at yellow. And he said, this one, it never changed. And so
Mm.
then the tester came in, tested, and they passed the test with flying colors.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, people who do the vacuuming, that's a big deal. Another thing that people don't realize, if you have a sliding window and you have plastic tracks in them, mold grows under that track. If it slides back and forth, and it's not wood, there's a track that comes out. We have videos that we also send that give step by step how to do that, but that track will come out and there's mold in there. The thing that people don't understand, and I've been an assessor on many jobs where a remediator has remediated a problem that water came in from the window or through a crack or something. They're remediating mold beneath the window. And I come in and I said, hey, you didn't even clean out this window properly. Like, you need to take the track out and stuff like that. They're like, don't worry, we took care of the mold. The mold was all down here. I'm like, but there's going to be mold in this track. And they fail it. And so it's like, you failed because you just didn't take that step. And it happens all the time. That is active water. That is active mold. Water, if a sprinkler is hitting a sliding glass window, that it comes down the window, goes into the track, and comes out weep holes. It's made to do that, right?
Yeah.
Or if rain is hitting it, it comes out of the weep holes. Well, when it's behind that track, there's dust in there, there's water and time, you have mold, right?
Yeah.
So it's taking out that window, taking out the track, cleaning that all really well, and then putting that back. That's something that I just don't think people pay enough attention to,
Yeah.
because it just doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. But imagine if mold grows and it creates spores, and when it dries, it releases spores, and then it gets wet again and grows, creates more spores, releases, grows, releases. That is an active problem adding mold to your house. And then
Yeah.
the settled spores, that's what you're doing when you're cleaning those. Another place that people aren't aware that it grows mold is in the toilet tank. And so
Yeah.
that in the toilet tank, if you take the top off, clean that up, soap and water, get rid of it. Just
Awesome.
clean it and clean it down.
And I can verify we have done all of those in our home and the places that we've been. And it is crazy, like, to know that you do feel different vacuuming 15 times. I'll tell you, with our post remediation remodel, we are taking all carpet out of our house, but that even before then, that vacuuming, and we spent an extended time in a vacation home, and dust management is what we spent the first couple days doing, because it's like we've got to make sure we just get it all out. And even that alone, like you said, and this is kind of where we'll wrap up in the takeaways, is you know the best thing you can do, if we're best is figure this out and get it out and work with somebody like you to do this. But even then, and then ongoing, because once you remediate and get all the mold out, that's great. But dust is still going to cause problems, right? And the toilet's still going to do this. The windows are still going to do this. So this is on a regular cadence. Figure out how you're going to really take time to clean and de-dust your home on an ongoing basis, because that's what's truly going to make the difference for your health, for your healing, and to be able to do this. So I think, we could do 3 of these, but today, my what I want, is for people who are local in Utah, how do they get a hold of you? For people that might not be here, if they're able to get access to some of your videos or content, or what resources or what they should look for where they are, and how can I put them in touch with you as a resource for that?
Yeah. So best way is probably go to our website. It's vitalutah.com. And our contact info's there. Reach out to us. And then if you're out of state, yeah, reach out. Ask for access to the info. I'm happy to do that for your clients.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, we could talk about this all day long. But again, and I will tell you, from a clinical standpoint and a personal standpoint, the nonsensical part of this illness, this biotoxin illness, call it CIRS, call it biotox, is that the building makes a huge difference. There's so many health conditions in our world that we apply the right medical health support to, and people get better. This is such a unique instance where we can do everything perfect medically or from a healthcare perspective and still maybe only get somebody 50, 60, 70 or less better if they're living in a place of complete exposure. And if we want to try to prevent relapses, exposure is huge. And so, and we'll probably have another conversation again, but I want to thank Mike for coming on, one, because of the amazing job they've done in our home, two, the amazing job that they do taking care of clients. But as I've gotten to know you personally, you do have a passion for making healthy environments for people and done the right way. And as you and I have talked about people, it's like, look, doing the wrong thing is not just disappointing because they're doing the wrong thing. It's disappointing because people are wasting money on things that do not work and then still not getting healthy. And
Yeah.
so again, in your industry, one, it's rare to find people who do it the right way. Two, I think it's rare to find somebody like yourself and your team, by the way, your team is phenomenal, who actually care about creating a healthy, safe environment for the occupants. So I just want to thank you for all that you guys are doing and continue to do. I also think you're not done learning of how to do this better, which is fantastic. And so thank you very much. Thanks for joining this conversation today. We'll share this, we'll get it out there. And I'll make sure we put your links and everything there. So if people need the resources, they can reach out to you and we can help them get better.
That's awesome. Let me give you one last morsel that I think
Yeah.
that people miss. And so this is for the people who actually stayed on, right? I think more people are being, like you said, are being exposed to toxins, not just mold. Mold is what we
Yes.
focus on, but actinomycetes is another
Yep.
one that grows in the same spots that mold grows in. And so it's like, go do what you need to, like the remediation for actinomycetes is super easy. It's clean all your wet areas in your house, like your sinks and your showers and your toilets, twice a week. Deep clean those twice a week. And
Mm.
then use that defense soap.
Yes.
Which is a soap that's going to kill that bacteria on you. Use that every day while you're showering. And it's like the example I put is if it's like you and I are standing there and we're throwing a 12-inch snowball at each other. Over time, we're not going to have anything to throw at each other. That's not going to have to be a thing that you do forever, but it's going
Right.
to be a thing you're going to do for a while that's going to get rid of the actinomycetes or the actinobacterias, maybe even endotoxins that are in your wet areas, and then it's going to also get it off your skin. So it's just
Love
over
that.
time. That's I think that's something that so many people miss, and it's so easy. It's like just do it. It's cheap. It's easy. Just and it
When I tell people you're already showering with soap, hopefully, so just change the soap that you're using and some of the cleaning agents you're already using, and you can make a dramatic difference. So we'll have to do a version 2 of this. Thanks so much for hopping on, and yeah, we'll put your links and how everybody to get it connected to this when we publish this, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, Mike.